Violetta's party began with the scent of orange zest and spices. In the large top-floor apartment, the windows were thrown open, and the city breathed warm wind into the dark. The string lights fractured in the glasses, and the music flowed from room to room like a conversation no one dared to have outright. Ailina arrived with her husband, Dennis. They had lived for several years like a well-oiled mechanism, precise, predictable, without unexpected breakdowns. Dennis liked plans and lists. Ailina liked sudden turns, but she had been keeping her turns to herself lately. Her life lacked color, even though there was too much paint all around. Violetta, the hostess, was in her element in a deep green silk dress, with a touch of weariness on her face that somehow suited her. She gathered people the way one assembles a puzzle of mismatched pieces, and each time the picture turned out to be surprisingly complete. "How are you two?" she asked, winking at Ailina. "There'll be dancing, if you're up for it, and the terrace if you need some air." Ailina smiled and nodded. Dennis was already talking to colleagues. They were sorting a new project into tidy compartments, as if the evening were merely an extension of the office, only with lemon sorbet and vinyl. Ailina stepped out onto the terrace. It was quieter there. The hum of music softened into a gentle backdrop, and the city below looked like a pattern. Perched on the balustrade sat a man in a light shirt, short-haired, with a barely there smile. Ailina recognized him at once, though she hadn't expected Tulia, a classmate, the one who was always late to lectures and always brought something interesting. A stylus instead of a pen, someone else's book instead of his own, a story instead of an answer. "It's been years," he said, not getting up. "You have the same eyes, and you still talk in riddles," Ailina replied, leaning against a column. They talked about trifles, then about the past, then about what was missing. The world shifted very softly, the way a curtain moves in the dark when the wind stirs. Ilya laughed, and in his laughter there was freedom. Ailina listened and suddenly realized she hadn't listened like this in a long time. Not because there was nothing worth hearing, but because lately everything around her had sounded the same. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, and even to herself it sounded alien. The music swelled, someone dimmed the lights in the living room, and people began to whirl. Ailina and Ilya went back inside, found themselves in semi-darkness where the glow of the garlands turned faces into something like watercolors. It was easy to get lost in the crowd. Someone nudged them into the circle of dancers. Ilya set his hand lightly on Alina's shoulder, barely touching, like testing the water to see if it's cold. She closed her eyes for a moment. Something clicked inside her, like a lamp being switched on. Dennis, spotting her, waved from across the room, the same predictable gesture she knew by heart. Ailina nodded and immediately lost sight of him. The room throbbed, laughter and shadows layered over one another. Ilya whispered, "It's loud here. Want to go to the library?" "Viola keeps it quiet." Violetta did love books, old bindings along the wall, smelling of dust and mint. The room was dim, only a desk lamp burned, leaving the corners wrapped in soft shadow. Ailina stood by the window, running a finger over the cold glass as if drawing an invisible line. "Sometimes I think," Ilya said, "we live too neatly, as if we're afraid to cut ourselves on something real." She smiled, but in her smile there was more tenderness for her former self than agreement. He came closer. Nothing was spoken outright. No grand declarations. Only a pause. And into that pause they both stepped. It wasn't loud. Not cinematic. Not a storm. More like a warm rain that started from nowhere and, at some point, became an undeniable reality. Suddenly there were wet hands, breath someone else's. Too close, and the feeling that a long-forgotten part of yourself had been returned to you. But in that, too, there was unease, because the rain passes and the traces remain. When they came out, time slipped back into place like a book onto its shelf. Ailina smoothed her hair. Ilya smiled his barely noticeable smile. The hallway was empty, only the clink of dishes drifted in from the kitchen. Violetta stood in the doorway, perhaps by chance, perhaps not, and with her clear, attentive gaze seemed to draw a line under it. She said nothing. She simply handed Eilina a glass of water. "Here," she said softly. "It's a dry summer." Eilina drained it and felt her throat twitch with gratitude and shame at once. In the living room, the lights were already brighter. Someone shouted a toast. The music slipped into a faster rhythm. Dennis came over and put an arm around her waist. Habitual, kind. "Where did you disappear to?" he asked. "Listen, the guys came up with a great idea for the algorithm." His voice was a calm shore. Eilina listened and nodded. She looked at him and tried to remember anew everything they'd built, every tiny detail, every shared day. All there we. And at the same time, she felt another eye living inside her, still damp from the rain, trembling like a bird just released from cupped hands. They left late. The stairwell smelled of paint and someone's Kino violet pigment. In the elevator, mirrors stretched their reflections. Dennis talked about next week's meetings. Eilina nodded and thought about how tomorrow she would brew jasmine tea and throw the window wide open so the air could go out and come back in again. And how, perhaps, she would tell the truth or learn to live with this new crack. Cracks aren't always about breaking. After all, they can be about the light that breaks through. Violetta saw the guests out at the door. When it was their turn, she lightly touched Lena's shoulder. "Come again," she said. "I'm thinking of a small evening soon. Vinyl, poetry, a bit of quiet." "Thank you," Eilina replied. Their eyes met, and in that silence there was understanding. In other people's homes, sometimes your own stories begin, and not all of them can be taken away without leaving a trace. Outside, the air was fresh. The city became big and impersonal again. Eilina took Dennis' arm, as she had 1,000 times, but now her hand settled differently, more carefully. She looked ahead and understood. No plan could save her from what had already happened, but no accident could cancel what needed to be done next. That, perhaps, was the answer, not in choosing between the past and a sudden impulse, but in being honest with herself and those beside her. That night, back home, she stood at the window for a long time. There was no rain, only the rare sweep of headlights across the walls and the scent of jasmine that felt almost imagined. Eilina closed her eyes and, for the first time in a long while, allowed herself not to explain anything away. Morning, as always, would come, and with it a conversation, or silence. In any case, responsibility, and perhaps light.